December 7, 1941, 7:55 a.m., USS West Virginia, Pearl Harbor. Doris Miller, a 22-year-old mess attendant 3rd class, was collecting laundry when the first torpedo struck. His battle station assignment: collect the wounded, not fight back. Navy regulations forbade him from receiving weapons training. Within 90 minutes, he would man an anti-aircraft gun he'd never been trained to use. For Japanese planes would fall. The contradiction was absolute. An untrained man performing what trained gunners couldn't. What happened in those 90 minutes would expose a system that wasted talent while men died. Stories shaped by moments like this demand preservation. If you want accounts that reveal overlooked truths about capability meeting crisis, stay with Battlefront Insider. Doris Miller enlisted in the United States Navy in September 1939. He came from Waco, Texas, where he'd been a high school football star. He was physically exceptional, powerful build, quick reflexes, natural athleticism. The Navy saw none of this as relevant to his assigned role. Miller was placed in the Messman Branch. This wasn't a choice. Navy policy in 1939 restricted black sailors to the Messman Branch exclusively. The duties were specific: cooking, cleaning, serving officers, maintaining officer quarters. No combat training was provided to messmen, regardless of aptitude or interest. Miller was assigned to the USS West Virginia as a mess attendant 3rd class. He served food in the officer wardroom. He cleaned officer staterooms. He collected and delivered laundry. He did this competently without complaint for 2 years. While other crew members received gunnery training, damage control training, and combat preparation, Miller learned how officers preferred their coffee. The Navy's policy was clear: messmen could not advance to combat positions. This wasn't based on capability assessment. It was based on race. The system functioned as designed: segregation enforced through job classification. Talented men were restricted to service roles while combat positions went to white sailors, regardless of comparative ability. By late 1941, war tensions were rising across the Pacific. Japan had invaded China, occupied French Indochina, and threatened further expansion. The United States Pacific Fleet was concentrated at Pearl Harbor: 90 ships, 390 aircraft, tens of thousands of personnel. The fleet represented America's primary deterrent against Japanese aggression. Miller's battle station assignment reflected his classification. When the ship went to general quarters, his role was to carry ammunition and retrieve wounded. Not a combat role, a logistics role. He wasn't trained to fight because Navy policy said he wouldn't fight. The West Virginia had dozens of trained gunners for its anti-aircraft batteries. The system assumed they would be sufficient. December 7th began like any other Sunday. Breakfast service started early. Miller served officers their morning meal, cleaned up afterward, began collecting laundry. The routine was familiar. The ship was quiet. Most crew members had weekend liberty or were sleeping in. The morning was calm, warm, peaceful. The system was functioning exactly as designed. Officers ate. Messmen served. Gunners prepared for drills that wouldn't happen until Monday. Everything in its place, everyone in their role. The organizational structure was clear, rigid, and completely unquestioned. What the system didn't account for was simple: crisis doesn't follow regulations. Capability doesn't respect artificial boundaries. And in approximately 10 minutes, the gap between policy and reality would become fatal. At 7:55 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor. 183 planes, fighters, bombers, torpedo planes, attacked simultaneously. The USS West Virginia took immediate hits. Torpedoes struck the port side. The explosions were catastrophic. The crew rushed to battle stations, but the attack's intensity disrupted trained responses immediately. Multiple officers were killed in the first minutes, including Captain Mervyn Benyon, who was struck by shrapnel on the bridge. The command structure fragmented instantly. Junior officers suddenly responsible for decisions they'd never trained to make. Gun stations needed operators. Many trained gunners were dead, trapped below decks, or dealing with damage control. The ship listed heavily from torpedo damage. Water flooded compartments. Fires broke out. The West Virginia was sinking. And Japanese planes continued their attack unopposed from multiple angles. Miller reached his assigned battle station and began helping wounded. He carried injured men through smoke-filled passageways. He dragged sailors from flooding compartments. The ship listed 28 degrees, severe enough to threaten capsizing. Men screamed from behind sealed watertight doors. Miller could hear them but couldn't reach them. The doors had to stay sealed or the entire ship would flood faster. Lieutenant Commander Doyer ordered Miller to the bridge. Captain Benyon was dying from his wounds. Miller helped move him to shelter, tried to make him comfortable. There was nothing else to be done. The captain couldn't be saved. He couldn't command. And the ship was still under attack. Meanwhile, anti-aircraft gun positions sat unmanned. Their trained operators were casualties. The guns themselves were functional. Ammunition was available. But Navy policy had created a fatal gap. Capable men existed on the ship who could operate those weapons, but they weren't authorized to do so. The problem crystallized with brutal clarity. The West Virginia had men with physical strength, quick thinking, and demonstrated courage. Miller had proven all three by rescuing wounded under fire. But he had zero gunnery training because Navy regulations forbade providing it to messmen. The system had artificially restricted capability in the name of organizational order. Other ships across Pearl Harbor faced identical problems. Trained gunners became casualties early. Gun positions emptied. Messmen, restricted by policy from combat roles, carried wounded while planes attacked unopposed. The defensive response weakened not from lack of weapons or ammunition, but from lack of authorized personnel. The mathematical reality was straightforward. Fewer defensive guns firing meant more successful Japanese attacks. More successful attacks meant more casualties. More casualties meant fewer trained defenders. The spiral accelerated downward, enforced by peacetime regulations that assumed the command structure would survive first contact. It didn't. Captain Benyon dying couldn't change the rules. Junior officers focused on immediate crises: flooding, fires, casualties. No one had time to consider policy reform. And Japanese planes circled for another attack run. Miller watched men die who might have survived if more guns had fired. Each attacking plane represented the cost of organizational rigidity. The Navy had built a system optimized for peacetime order. That system was failing catastrophically under combat conditions. And the men paying the price were those the system claimed to protect. The frustration wasn't abstract. It was immediate and lethal. Capable defenders existed. Weapons existed. Ammunition existed. Authorization didn't exist. Policy prevented the Navy from using resources it already had. Every unmanned gun was evidence of systematic failure. Every successful Japanese attack proved the cost. The USS Arizona exploded nearby. The shockwave killed more West Virginia crew members. Fire spread. The second wave of Japanese aircraft arrived. 171 more planes. The attack would continue for 2 more hours. And the fundamental problem remained unsolved. The system couldn't adapt fast enough to survive its own restrictions. The USS West Virginia sustained 6 torpedo hits and 2 bomb hits within the first 20 minutes. The damage was catastrophic. 106 crew members would die that day. Many died instantly from explosions. Others drowned in flooded compartments. Some burned in fires that couldn't be controlled. The mathematics of destruction were absolute. Captain Benyon lay dying on the bridge. Shrapnel had torn through his abdomen. He remained conscious, unable to command but aware of his ship's destruction. Junior officers made decisions he should have made. They were overwhelmed by simultaneous crises. Every decision was triage. Save the ship or save the men. Stop flooding or fight fires. Man the guns or rescue the trapped. There were no right answers. Miller moved between wounded, dragging them from flooding compartments. Each man he saved revealed another who couldn't be reached. Some were too badly injured to move. Others were trapped by twisted metal. Miller made impossible choices in seconds. Who to save first when everyone needed help immediately? These were decisions that would haunt trained officers for decades. Miller had minutes to make them while under fire. The ship listed more severely. 28 degrees of list meant walking required holding walls. Equipment slid across decks. Ammunition rolled loose. The danger compounded with each degree of tilt. If the ship capsized, everyone still aboard would die. The engineering crews fought to counterflood, deliberately flooding starboard compartments to balance the portside torpedo damage. This saved the ship but killed men trapped in those compartments. Miller pulled Lieutenant Frederick White from flames. White survived. 3 men standing next to him didn't. The randomness of survival created psychological weight impossible to process in the moment. Why did one man live while another died? Location, timing, chance. Nothing rational. Nothing fair. The USS Arizona exploded at 8:06 a.m. 1,177 men died instantly. The explosion's shockwave hit the West Virginia, killing additional crew members and starting new fires. Miller felt the concussion, saw the fireball, understood immediately that everyone aboard Arizona was dead. The scale of death became incomprehensible. Individual losses compounded into statistical horror. Japanese planes continued strafing runs. They fired machine guns at exposed crew members. Men died on deck while trying to reach battle stations. Anti-aircraft fire from other ships created additional danger. Shells that missed Japanese planes fell back into the harbor. Friendly fire killed Americans. The chaos made every action risky. Miller carried wounded men to 8 stations. Medical personnel were overwhelmed. More casualties arrived than could be treated. Doctors performed triage in impossible conditions. Save those who could be saved. Make comfortable those who couldn't. The decisions were clinical, necessary, and devastating. Meanwhile, anti-aircraft guns sat unmanned. Each minute they remained silent, more Japanese planes attacked successfully. The direct correlation was obvious. More defensive fire meant fewer successful attacks. Fewer successful attacks meant fewer casualties. But manning the guns required authorized personnel. And authorized personnel were dead. The injustice compounded with each passing minute. Capable defenders existed on the ship. Miller had proven his capability by rescuing wounded under fire while the ship sank beneath him. His physical strength, quick decision-making, and courage were evident. But Navy policy prevented him from accessing weapons. He could carry dying men but couldn't fire back at the planes killing them. Other messmen across the fleet faced identical situations. They demonstrated courage, capability, and dedication while restricted from contributing to the ship's defense. They carried wounded while planes attacked unopposed. They fought fires while bombs fell. They did everything except what they were capable of doing, fighting back. Some ships lost all trained gunners within minutes of the attack starting. Guns sat functional but silent. Damage wasn't the problem. Authorization was the problem. The policy barrier became a death sentence. Men died who could have survived if organizational structure had permitted reality-based responses. Miller watched planes circle for another attack run. He watched tracers from other ships try to intercept them. He watched some planes get hit, others complete their runs successfully. And he understood with absolute clarity, if more guns fired, fewer planes would succeed. The mathematics were undeniable. The policy prevented the mathematics from matching. If this examination of systematic failures that cost lives reveals something worth remembering about organizational rigidity under crisis, consider staying with Battlefront Insider for more investigations into moments when policy collided with necessity. Captain Benyon died at approximately 8:30 a.m. His last orders concerned damage control and crew safety. He couldn't address the policy failures that had contributed to his crew's casualties. He died following the system he'd served, the system that had failed him and his men. And the attack continued. Second-wave aircraft arrived. More bombs fell. More torpedoes struck other ships. And the fundamental problem remained: capable men restricted by policy while authorized men lay dead. Lieutenant Commander Doyer assessed the situation on the bridge. Captain Benyon was dead. The ship was severely damaged but still afloat. Damage control teams were working on flooding and fires. But the attack continued. Japanese planes circled for additional runs. And multiple anti-aircraft gun positions remained unmanned. Doyer faced a decision that transcended immediate tactics. Navy regulations were explicit about crew assignments. Messmen operated in service roles. Combat positions required specific training and authorization. The policy existed for organizational clarity. Everyone knew their role. The system functioned through rigid adherence to assigned duties. But the system assumed the command structure would survive. It assumed trained personnel would be available for combat positions. It assumed crisis would follow peacetime protocols. None of these assumptions had survived the first 10 minutes of combat. Doyer looked at Doris Miller. Miller had just carried multiple wounded men to safety. He'd moved through flooding compartments, fire, and enemy strafing to rescue sailors. He was physically powerful, demonstrably brave, and capable of quick decision-making under pressure. These were exactly the qualities needed for anti-aircraft gun operation. Miller had no gunnery training. Navy policy had forbidden providing it. But neither did several junior officers who'd been pressed into gun positions during the chaos. Training was theoretical. Combat was real. And the ship needed every gun firing. The question wasn't whether Miller could learn to operate the weapon. The question was whether breaking policy during combat constituted legitimate command discretion or unauthorized deviation. If Doyer ordered Miller to a gun position and Miller failed, the decision would be questioned. If Miller succeeded, the decision would expose how many other capable men had been artificially restricted. Every outcome carried consequences beyond the immediate tactical situation. This wasn't just about firing one gun. It was about challenging the foundational assumption of Navy personnel policy, that segregation by race aligned with capability segregation. Combat was proving otherwise. Doyer made his decision in seconds. He ordered Miller to an unmanned .50 caliber Browning anti-aircraft gun position. The order was direct, unambiguous, and technically unauthorized. Miller wasn't trained. He wasn't supposed to access weapons. But the ship was under attack, men were dying, and capability mattered more than authorization. Miller faced his own crossroad. He could refuse the order, point out that he lacked training, that regulations forbade his operating combat weapons. The refusal would be justified by policy. It would also mean the gun stayed silent while planes attacked. He could accept the order and fail. No training meant high probability of ineffective fire. He might waste ammunition, might fail to hit targets, might prove that training requirements existed for valid reasons. Failure would justify the restrictions. It would confirm the system's assumptions about specialized roles. Or he could accept the order and succeed. Success would prove that capable men had been systematically prevented from contributing to ship defense. It would demonstrate that Navy policy wasted talent while men died. It would raise uncomfortable questions about how many other Doris Millers existed across the fleet, restricted by regulations rather than evaluated by capability. Miller understood these implications. Perhaps not consciously, not in academic terms. But he understood that his performance would be scrutinized. That it would mean something beyond the immediate tactical situation. That every trigger pull would be evidence in a larger argument about who could fight and who couldn't. The pressure wasn't just tactical. It was ideological. He wasn't just defending a ship. He was challenging assumptions about capability and race that the Navy had institutionalized into policy. His success or failure would be used to justify or question those assumptions for years afterward. Miller moved to the gun position. The .50 caliber Browning anti-aircraft gun was mounted on a pedestal, rotated manually, and required physical strength to traverse quickly. It fired 450 to 550 rounds per minute at effective range of 2,000 yards against aircraft. Miller had watched trained gunners operate these weapons during drills. He'd observed from a distance, never allowed to touch the weapon himself. Now he was responsible for operating it under combat conditions. No manual existed that would help. No training officer could provide guidance. The ship's experienced gunners were dead or incapacitated. Miller was alone with a weapon system he understood theoretically but had never touched. The gun was hot from previous firing. Spent brass littered the deck. Ammunition belts lay nearby, some full, some partially expended. The mechanics were straightforward. Load the belt, charge the weapon, acquire target, lead the aim point, fire in controlled bursts. Simple in theory. Complex in execution. Other crew members watched. Some were skeptical. How could an untrained messman operate an anti-aircraft gun effectively? Others were hopeful. They'd seen Miller's courage rescuing wounded, perhaps capability would translate. Junior officers managing damage control couldn't supervise. They trusted Doyer's judgment and focused on immediate crises. The ship shuddered from another explosion. More men screamed for help below decks. Japanese planes circled, regrouping for another attack run. The harbor filled with smoke from burning ships. The USS Arizona was gone. The USS Oklahoma had capsized. The USS California was sinking. The West Virginia itself might not survive another major hit. Miller loaded an ammunition belt into the Browning. His hands moved with certainty. The physical mechanics were intuitive. Insert belt, ensure proper feed, pull charging handle. He'd watched this procedure dozens of times. Observation had taught him what formal training had been denied. He gripped the weapon's handles. Traversed it left and right to test movement. The gun rotated smoothly despite the ship's list. His physical strength made weapon manipulation easier than it would be for smaller men. Years of manual labor had built exactly the muscle memory needed for this task. The crossroad resolved in action. Miller chose to fight. The consequences would follow. Rules were broken. Authorization was absent. But capability was present, opportunity existed, and men needed defense. The decision was made. The moral weight accepted. The gun loaded and ready. What happened in the next 15 minutes would determine whether capability without authorization could succeed where authorization without capability had failed. Miller tracked incoming Japanese aircraft through the Browning's iron sights. Multiple planes approached in loose formation, preparing for bombing runs on ships still afloat. His first challenge was target selection, which plane to engage when multiple threats existed simultaneously. He chose the closest, following instinct rather than training. His first burst missed completely. The rounds passed behind the target. Miller had underestimated the lead required. Aircraft moved faster than his initial aim compensated for. He adjusted immediately, increasing forward aim, compensating for both aircraft speed and projectile travel time. Second burst closer. He saw water splashes beyond the target where rounds impacted the harbor. Still behind but less so. The adjustment was working. He was learning in real time, each burst providing feedback, each miss teaching him what the Navy had refused to teach formally. Third burst connected. He saw strikes on the aircraft's wing. Metal fragments sparkled where rounds hit. The plane wobbled, pilot fighting for control. It didn't fall immediately, continued flying but turned away from its attack run. Miller didn't wait for confirmation. More planes incoming. He shifted to the next target. The gun heated up from sustained fire. Barrel temperature rose with each burst. Miller maintained controlled fire, short bursts, not continuous stream. Conservation of ammunition and weapon management, principles he understood from observation even without formal instruction. Fourth target, low-flying bomber completing its run. Larger target, slower speed. Easier engagement. Miller fired a longer burst directly into the fuselage. The plane shuddered visibly. Smoke erupted from the engine. Altitude dropped sharply. The bomber hit the harbor water hard, broke apart on impact. Confirmed kill. Miller traversed the gun to new targets without celebration or acknowledgement. No time for assessment. The tactical situation demanded continuous engagement. Japanese planes kept coming. Each one shot down meant one fewer threat to the ship and harbor. His body adapted to the weapon's recoil automatically. Shoulders absorbed the impact. Feet stayed planted despite the ship's list. Core muscles compensated for instability. The physical demands of anti-aircraft gunnery were significant, but Miller's build handled them naturally. Loading new ammunition belts became automatic. His eyes tracked aircraft while his hands worked independently, feeding belts without looking down. The coordination developed within minutes. Capability emerged from necessity. Training would have accelerated this process, but absence of training hadn't prevented it. Fifth plane entered his engagement zone. Miller fired immediately upon acquiring target. The plane banked hard to evade. His rounds tracked the movement, following the turn. Hits registered along the fuselage and tail section. The plane continued its evasive maneuver, breaking off from formation, trailing smoke. It disappeared behind other ships. Probable kill. The damage looked severe enough to prevent return. Sixth target approached from a different angle. Fighter aircraft, faster and more maneuverable than bombers. Harder target. Miller led aggressively, firing where the plane would be rather than where it was. The fighter rolled, attempting evasion. Miller's burst caught it mid-roll. Rounds hit cockpit and wing. The plane rolled inverted and went down. Crashed into the harbor. Fourth confirmed kill or disable. The engagement lasted approximately 15 minutes of sustained combat. Miller fired hundreds of rounds. He experienced weapon jams twice, cleared them using procedures he'd observed, resumed firing within seconds. The mechanical operation became intuitive through repetition. Other gunners on nearby ships saw the West Virginia's gun position firing effectively. They didn't know who operated it. They saw coordinated defensive fire helping to disrupt Japanese attack formations. The tactical effect was measurable. Planes broke off approaches, scattered their formations, reduced accuracy. Miller's ammunition belt ran dry. A crew member rushed a replacement forward. The sailor looked shocked seeing Miller at the gun but said nothing. He loaded the fresh belt and returned to cover. Miller resumed firing immediately. The transition took less than 10 seconds. Pattern recognition developed rapidly. Miller learned to distinguish bomber approach patterns from fighter strafing runs. He prioritized targets based on immediate threat. Bombers carrying ordnance got priority over fighters already expended. The tactical decision-making emerged from combat experience compressed into minutes. His hands bled from gripping hot metal. He didn't notice until later. Adrenaline masked pain. Focus remained absolute. Each plane was a threat. Each trigger pull was defense of shipmates. The abstract concept of gunnery became concrete through immediate necessity. The untrained gunner operated with increasing efficiency. No formal training had occurred. But combat provided the most effective training possible. Immediate feedback, life or death stakes, pattern recognition accelerated by necessity. Miller learned in 15 minutes what formal training might have taught in weeks. The gun barrel glowed red from sustained fire. Cooling was necessary but impossible during active engagement. Miller fired through the heat, accepting reduced accuracy at extreme temperatures. The weapon functioned beyond its recommended operational parameters. So did Miller. A Japanese bomber approached for a direct run on the West Virginia. The ship had already sustained catastrophic damage. It couldn't survive another major hit. The bomber's payload would likely sink the vessel or kill remaining crew. This was not theoretical danger. This was immediate, terminal threat. Miller tracked the bomber through its approach vector. The plane committed to its attack run, flying straight toward the ship. Other anti-aircraft fire from nearby vessels created crossfire. Tracers crossed the sky. Smoke from burning ships obscured visibility. Miller waited for a clear firing solution. The bomber pilot was focused on target acquisition, maintaining steady flight for accurate bomb release. This made him vulnerable. Straight trajectory, predictable path, committed to approach. Miller opened fire with a sustained burst aimed directly at the aircraft's nose and cockpit. Tracers showed his rounds connecting. The engine caught fire immediately. Flames erupted from the cowling. The pilot attempted to pull up, abort the attack run. Too late. The fire spread too quickly. Control surfaces failed. The plane lost altitude rapidly, crashed into the harbor short of its target. The bombs exploded on water impact, throwing up massive geysers but causing no additional ship damage. Direct kill. Immediate threat eliminated. The bomber never released its payload on target. Miller had just saved his ship from potentially fatal damage. He shifted to the next target without pause. No time for recognition of what he'd accomplished. More planes incoming. Another bomber approached from a different angle, attempting to capitalize on the chaotic defensive fire. Miller traversed the gun rapidly, acquired the new target, fired shorter bursts to conserve remaining ammunition. Hits registered along the fuselage and tail section. Control surfaces damaged. The bomber broke off its attack, trailing heavy smoke, limping away from the harbor. It wouldn't return. Probable kill, too damaged to make another run. Third engagement of this critical phase. Enemy fighter on strafing run, targeting exposed crew on deck. Faster, more maneuverable than bombers. Miller led the target aggressively, compensating for speed and angle. He fired as the plane crossed his engagement zone. Hits registered on wing and cockpit. The fighter rolled inverted, lost control, crashed into the water. Fourth confirmed kill or disable of the engagement. The ammunition belt ran empty. Another crew member delivered a replacement. Miller reloaded and resumed firing within seconds. The sustained combat had lasted approximately 15 minutes total. 4 aircraft engaged successfully. Multiple other planes driven off or damaged. 0 prior training. 0 authorization. Complete effectiveness. This was the test. Could capability without training succeed where training without opportunity had failed? The evidence was undeniable. Miller had defended his ship more effectively than many trained gunners because he was given the chance to do so. The Navy's policy hadn't prevented capability, it had only prevented opportunity. The moment crystallized everything wrong with the system. Talented men existed throughout the fleet, restricted by policy from contributing their full capability. How many other Doris Millers were carrying laundry instead of defending ships? How many capable defenders were wasted because organizational structure valued racial segregation over tactical effectiveness? Lieutenant Commander Doyer witnessed the engagement. He saw Miller's performance. He understood immediately that his decision to break policy had been tactically correct and systematically revealing. One unauthorized gunner had proven more effective than the policy preventing his training. If courage without authorization can succeed where systems fail to adapt, consider following Battlefront Insider for more investigations into capability meeting crisis. Other officers saw it too. Word spread across the ship. The messman was shooting down planes. Initial disbelief gave way to confirmation. Multiple witnesses. Undeniable results. The policy barrier had been breached, and the tactical outcome validated the breach. The test was passed definitively. Miller had proven capable of performing a role the Navy said he couldn't perform. He'd done it without training, without authorization, without institutional support. He'd done it because capability existed regardless of whether policy recognized it. And dozens of witnesses had seen the proof. Word spread rapidly across the USS West Virginia's remaining crew. The messman was operating an anti-aircraft gun. Effectively. Men who'd seen it couldn't deny what happened. Officers who'd witnessed it couldn't dismiss it as rumor. The evidence was immediate and undeniable. Doris Miller had defended the ship successfully without the training Navy policy said was necessary. Junior officers reported the action to senior command. The reports were factual, unembellished. Miller had been ordered to an unmanned gun position during combat. He'd engaged multiple enemy aircraft. He'd achieved confirmed kills. The tactical contribution was measurable. The policy violation was obvious. Miller's performance created immediate questions that extended beyond individual heroism. If one untrained messman could fight effectively, what about others? The West Virginia had multiple messmen aboard. Other ships had similar crew compositions. How much defensive capability was being wasted because policy prevented its use? The ship continued taking damage but survived the attack. The West Virginia didn't sink. Damage control teams kept it afloat despite massive flooding and severe list. The defensive fire, improved when Miller and other gunners engaged, helped reduce subsequent attack effectiveness. The tactical correlation was clear. More guns firing meant fewer successful Japanese attacks. Other ships across Pearl Harbor faced identical personnel crises. Trained gunners were casualties. Gun positions emptied. Messmen, restricted by policy from combat roles, carried wounded and fought fires while weapons sat unmanned. The systematic pattern revealed systematic failure. Miller's example reached other vessels through radio communication and visual observation. Some commanders made similar decisions. Other messmen moved to gun positions during the chaos. Not all succeeded like Miller, but some did. Capability existed throughout the fleet, waiting for necessity to reveal it. The policy barrier began breaking under combat pressure. Not through official reform, through tactical necessity. Individual commanders making individual decisions that collectively challenged institutional policy. Each decision created precedent. Each success created evidence. By the end of the attack, multiple black sailors had manned weapons without authorization. None had received official gunnery training. All had proven capable when given opportunity. The systematic pattern was revealing. Policy restricted capability that combat proved existed. The attack ended late morning. The damage assessment was catastrophic. 2,403 Americans dead. 1,178 wounded. 8 battleships damaged or sunk. 188 aircraft destroyed. The Pacific Fleet was crippled. But the defensive response had stiffened during the latter phases. Aircraft shoot-down rates increased when more guns fired. Miller's contribution was measurable within that improvement. The immediate ripple was tactical. Policy questioned under fire, commanders making unauthorized decisions that proved correct. The longer ripple was systematic. Evidence accumulated that segregation wasted capability. Each successful unauthorized engagement was data point proving policy failure. By afternoon, senior commanders compiled action reports. Miller's name appeared in multiple accounts. Lieutenant Commander Doyer's report noted the decision to arm him and the results. Other reports from other ships noted similar decisions. The pattern was documented officially. No disciplinary action was taken. Combat necessity provided legal defense for policy violations. The precedent was set. Not through official channels. Not through policy reform. Through combat results that couldn't be denied. Miller had proven something the Navy didn't want proven, that its personnel policies restricted capability based on race rather than aptitude. The evidence would spread slowly through official channels. But among crew members, the truth spread immediately. They'd seen it. The messmen shot down planes. The system was wrong about who could fight. Capability didn't follow policy lines. And everyone who witnessed it knew the Navy would have to respond somehow. Stories deserve examination when they challenge entire systems through individual action. If this investigation reveals something worth considering about institutional barriers and capability, explore more with Battlefront Insider. The ripple would continue expanding for years. Miller's moment would become teaching example, recruiting tool, policy challenge, and historical symbol. But in the immediate aftermath, the ripple was simple. One man proved the system wrong and witnesses ensured the proof couldn't be buried. Japanese aircraft returned to their carriers with damage reports. Pilots reported higher than expected anti-aircraft fire intensity from Pearl Harbor defenses. Some attributed increased resistance to American alertness or defensive improvements. They didn't know the actual cause. Desperate improvisation, not preparedness. The irony was complete. Japan's attack succeeded tactically but revealed American adaptability that contradicted assumptions about rigid military doctrine. Strategic analysis by Japanese Naval Command noted American defensive response but didn't identify specific causes. They saw outcome, not mechanism. The attack achieved its objective of crippling the Pacific Fleet. But it also demonstrated that American forces could adapt rapidly under pressure. This suggested future engagements might be more difficult than expected. Meanwhile, the United States Navy faced profoundly uncomfortable questions. Pearl Harbor exposed multiple systemic failures: intelligence failures, defensive preparation failures, command structure failures. Among these was a personnel policy failure that Miller's action made undeniable. Senior commanders reviewed action reports from multiple ships. Miller's performance appeared in Lieutenant Commander Doyer's official account. Similar incidents from other vessels were noted. Pattern emerged clearly: messmen performed effectively when allowed to fight. The Navy had evidence from actual combat that its personnel restrictions didn't align with capability reality. Navy Department leadership faced difficult choices about how to respond. The evidence contradicted official policy. Miller had violated training restrictions and succeeded. This raised questions about how many other violations would be necessary in future combat. It also raised questions about whether the restrictions served any purpose besides enforcing racial segregation. Initial institutional response was cautious acknowledgement. Miller was recommended for commendation. But the recommendation created policy dilemmas. How to honor a man for actions he wasn't authorized to take. How to praise effectiveness while maintaining the policy that prevented developing that effectiveness systematically. Public relations considerations complicated the response. Miller's story could embarrass the Navy by revealing policy failures. Or it could demonstrate institutional flexibility and merit recognition. The decision was made to pursue official recognition with careful framing. May 1942, Miller received the Navy Cross. He was the first African American to receive the decoration. Admiral Chester Nimitz personally presented it at a ceremony aboard the USS Enterprise. The citation praised Miller's distinguished devotion to duty, extraordinary courage, and disregard for his own personal safety during the attack. Notably, the citation didn't mention Miller's lack of authorization or training. It framed his actions as heroism, not policy violation. The Navy celebrated the individual while avoiding examination of the system that had restricted him. Miller was praised for breaking rules without acknowledging the rules were broken. Miller's story became recruitment tool. War bond drives featured his image. Recruiting efforts in black communities highlighted his Navy Cross. The Navy needed manpower. Miller became poster for military service. The irony deepened. Celebrating a man who broke rules while maintaining the rules that required breaking. Policy changes came slowly despite clear evidence. 1942 saw some combat roles open to black sailors, grudgingly and partially. 1944 brought first black commissioned officers. Full military desegregation didn't occur until 1948, 7 years after Pearl Harbor, ordered by President Truman through executive action rather than Navy initiative. Miller's action didn't immediately change Navy policy. But it created undeniable evidence that policy was flawed. Tactical reality proved faster than institutional reform. Combat necessity forced adaptations that peacetime politics prevented. Miller's 15 minutes demonstrated what the system refused to acknowledge. Capability transcended racial categories. Enemy perspective remained largely ignorant of specific stories. Japanese high command never knew about Miller specifically. But they noted American defensive improvements across subsequent engagements. They attributed these to experience and training, not recognizing that American forces were learning to use previously wasted capability. Strategic miscalculation compounded. Japan assumed Pearl Harbor would demoralize America. Instead, it galvanized response and revealed hidden capabilities. The attack united American public opinion, energized war production, and forced military adaptation that improved effectiveness. Systemic reaction within the Navy was slow institutional change against clear evidence. Miller's example was used selectively, praised personally, ignored systematically. Other messmen remained restricted despite proven capability. The contradiction persisted. Celebrate individual heroism, maintain structural barriers. World War II saw gradual integration driven by combat necessity rather than policy reform. Each major engagement revealed more examples of black sailors performing effectively when given opportunity. The accumulated evidence eventually overwhelmed policy resistance. But the process took years when combat had proven the point in minutes. Miller's moment was early evidence of inevitable change. Not because the Navy wanted to change, but because war forced recognition that organizational efficiency required using all available capability. Segregation was luxury of peacetime. Combat couldn't afford it. Doris Miller continued serving after Pearl Harbor. He was transferred to the USS Indianapolis in May 1942, then to the USS Liscum Bay escort carrier in 1943. His Navy Cross made him notable, but his duties remained largely unchanged. He served in the Pacific Theater as combat continued across multiple island campaigns. November 24, 1943, the Liscum Bay was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine near Makin Island in the Gilbert Islands. The torpedo struck the bomb magazine. The carrier exploded catastrophically and sank in 23 minutes. 646 crew members were killed. Doris Miller was among them. He was 24 years old. His body was never recovered. The Navy declared him killed in action. His death received less public attention than his Pearl Harbor heroism. Navy Cross recipient killed in combat was tragedy, not news. The war continued. Men died every day. Miller became another casualty statistic. His legacy survived him in ways that took decades to fully develop. Training facilities were later named in his honor. Ships bore his name posthumously. But the recognition was slow. First name tribute came in 1973, 30 years after his death. The delay reflected institutional reluctance to fully acknowledge what Miller represented. Miller's story became teaching example in military academies. His Pearl Harbor action was studied as leadership under crisis. The unauthorized decision to arm him was analyzed as appropriate command discretion during combat emergency. His effectiveness without training was examined as evidence that capability transcends formal preparation when necessity demands. Modern Navy references Miller regularly. His image appears in diversity training, recruitment materials, and historical education. He's presented as symbol of both heroism and historical injustice. The duality is intentional. Miller represents what individuals can achieve and what systems prevent. The resolution of his personal story is bittersweet. Quiet death, loud legacy. The man was forgotten by many, but the symbol was remembered. His 14 minutes of combat at Pearl Harbor defined his historical significance more than his entire service record. One moment, preserved and amplified, became larger than the life that produced it. His story gets used to teach lessons about wasted talent. How many other capable people were restricted by policy? How many contributions were never made because systems prevented opportunity? Miller proved the capability existed. His death proved the waste continued. Capable man killed while serving in segregated role rather than developed fully. The legacy question remains open. Did Miller's action change anything? Tactically, yes, he defended his ship successfully. Symbolically, yes, he proved policy assumptions wrong. Systematically, partially, change came slowly, reluctantly, years after combat proved its necessity. Individual heroism was celebrated. Systemic reform was delayed. Miller's story reveals fundamental tension in all organizations. Policy exists to create order and predictability. Crisis destroys both. Systems that can't adapt quickly fail catastrophically. Pearl Harbor proved this across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The military had intelligence failures, defensive failures, communication failures. Miller's moment captured one specific failure type: talent restriction. The Navy had built personnel policy around racial segregation rather than capability assessment. Peacetime allowed this. Combat couldn't afford it. The lesson isn't simply about racial integration, though that's part of it. The deeper lesson concerns organizational rigidity versus adaptation. Peacetime rules don't survive combat contact. Organizations that recognize this adapt faster. Organizations that resist evidence pay in lives and effectiveness. Miller had capability the Navy refused to develop. He wasn't unique. How many other men had similar and used capability? How many died because policy prevented their contribution? The numbers can't be calculated precisely, but the pattern is mathematically certain. Every artificial barrier restricts available capability. Some barriers serve purpose: specialization, safety, expertise development. Others serve only tradition or bias. Combat revealed which was which. Miller's 14 minutes proved his capability existed. The Navy's 7-year delay in full desegregation proved institutional resistance. The gap between evidence and reform measures systemic dysfunction. Good organizations learn from evidence quickly. Dysfunctional organizations resist evidence that challenges established structure. The universal truth transcends military context. Every system creates barriers. Some barriers are necessary, not everyone can do everything effectively. But many barriers are artificial, created by tradition, bias, or organizational inertia rather than capability assessment. Crisis reveals which barriers are functional and which are merely structural. Miller's moment matters because capability existed regardless of whether policy recognized it. Talent doesn't require institutional permission. It requires only opportunity. Organizations that provide opportunity to capability thrive. Organizations that restrict opportunity to protect policy structures waste resources while defending indefensible positions. The moral weight falls on systems, not individuals. Miller did what he was capable of doing when given chance. Doyer made correct tactical decision under pressure. The failure was systematic, policy that prevented developing capability before crisis demanded it. How many other crises could have been prevented if capability had been recognized and developed proactively? The lesson applies beyond military context. Every organization restricts some people from some roles. The question is whether those restrictions serve functional purpose or merely preserve existing power structures. Miller's story asks an uncomfortable question. How much capability is your organization wasting because policy prevents recognizing it? Systems that survive long-term learn to distinguish between necessary restrictions and artificial ones. They develop mechanisms for recognizing capability wherever it exists. They create pathways for talent to contribute regardless of whether that talent fits traditional categories. They adapt to evidence faster than crisis demands adaptation. Organizations that don't learn this fail slowly and expensively. They waste capability while defending the policies that waste it. They resist evidence until crisis forces recognition. And they pay in lives, effectiveness, and eventual obsolescence. Miller earned his Navy Cross in combat. He earned his place in historical memory by exposing truth about capability and policy. His 14 minutes proved something the Navy needed 7 years to officially acknowledge. That gap measures institutional failure, not individual heroism. Doris Miller's 14 minutes at Pearl Harbor mattered beyond immediate tactical results. 4 planes engaged, dozens of lives potentially saved, one system exposed as fundamentally flawed. His story isn't unique, it's representative of thousands of similar moments across World War II. Capability meeting opportunity despite institutional restrictions. Most went unrecorded. Some became legend. Miller's story became both. It serves as evidence of what was possible and reminder of what was systematically wasted. His legacy isn't just about courage, though he demonstrated that. It's about talent that doesn't require permission, just opportunity. It's about systems that restrict capability losing to systems that recognize it. It's about the cost of organizational rigidity measured in lives and effectiveness. Miller earned his Navy Cross through combat action. He earned his place in memory by proving that institutional barriers waste human potential. The Navy eventually learned this lesson. The learning took 7 years, cost countless lives, and came only because combat forced recognition that peacetime politics prevented. Stories like Miller's deserve continued examination. They teach lessons about courage, capability, and institutional resistance to evidence. They reveal how systems fail and how individuals succeed despite those failures. They ask uncomfortable questions about how much talent is wasted protecting policies that serve no functional purpose. If this investigation into capability meeting crisis despite systemic barriers revealed something worth remembering, consider subscribing to Battlefront Insider for more examinations of moments when individuals challenged institutional assumptions through action. We investigate the human stories behind military history, stories of courage, capability, and the systems that sometimes recognize both too late. This is Battlefront Insider, where we reveal the human stories behind every war.